Should be louder.
Hello, welcome. Thanks very much everyone for being here for this roundtable discussion organised by Urbanomic with Thomas Dane Gallery, who are at the moment showing two new works by John Gerrard, one of which you can see here behind us. I'm just going to give a broad introduction to the questions that we hope to be talking around tonight. Firstly, for those of you who perhaps aren't familiar with John Gerrard's work and don't quite know what you're seeing here, these works consist of three-dimensional portraits of sites that have been painstakingly reconstructed from multiple photographs and from geodata into a virtual model. So the animated image you're seeing here is being rendered in real time from a virtual model that runs over an entire solar year. So it's really a new medium. None of this is recorded, none of this is which speaks very directly to the subjects that it portrays. And I guess I'd characterize the subject matter as being about power and visibility. And in this case, this work, Farm Pryor Creek, Oklahoma, 2015, is a faithful model of a Google data farm, a massive data processing center in Oklahoma, which handles, I guess, trillions of search inquiries and all the other interactions that we have daily with Google services. So it's the physical site of services that I dare say every one of us in this room uses almost every day, but at the same time, there's obviously something quite uncanny about its physical presence. It's kind of a non-place. It's something that doesn't really exist for us in our everyday image of what the internet means to us. And of course, it's also a massively energy-intensive operation. It's an image of capital power, if you like. It's quite perplexing, since it also is largely dedicated to services that are nominally free to their users. Now, one of the things that precipitated the discussion around this work was actually one of John's earlier works, which is also shown in the other space of the gallery, and which is going to be shown in Britain later this month, called Sow Farm near Libby, Oklahoma, 2009. A portrait of a facility located not so far from this Google farm, and with some distinct similarities which go beyond its geographical isolation and its kind of functional blank architecture. In this sow farm, animals are housed in the massive warehouse type of structure, fed by automatic feeders, and left mainly unattended for the months that they're fattened up until they're then picked up and transported. Again, it's an effectively invisible site of production that lends itself, I think, to a reading in terms of the physical and political separation of production from the world of consumption that it serves. The invisibility or the virtuality of these sites of production that are in effect nowhere, or something like remote control consuming world. And in parallel to this first kind of disarticulation between these two worlds, I think the Google farm in particular also suggests a disarticulation between the experiential texture of the internet as some kind of space for leisure, for sociality, for cultural activity, and its physicality and its energy footprint. Simply to say that all of that immediate, interactive, fluid communication that we expect and that we to some extent rely on now is still an industrial scale, energy intensive operation. But then this strange disarticulation is doubled, of course, by the work bringing this physical site into the site of consumption in a virtual form. Then, by chance, really, a third figure entered into play in this complex of questions and in this articulation between these two farms. When last year we published, Urbanomic published with Sequence Press. It's a really extraordinary book written in 1998, a fierce polemic against the degradation of politics in the face of neoliberal marketisation. And I sent the book to John, and soon afterwards we started to kind of recognise it as some kind of missing link between these two farms that he'd made. Because in effect, in this kind of manic dystopian rant, I mean, the book is really stylistically extraordinary. Chatelet talks about it as being a kind of philosophical burlesque. And he really pushes to the point of hysteria, I guess, a kind of the parallel we could draw between these two farms, because he literally sees the population of contemporary market democracies being reduced to nodes whose only function is to process signals, and as what he calls cybercattle, kept content in virtual pastures as a reliable supply of a certain kind of subjective interaction that's convenient for neoliberal politics. So this book is really about the relation between the individual, the social, and the market, and its mediation by technology. And from Chatelet's point of view, if there's such a thing as a social dynamics, then for Chatelet it has to be a matter of the process of individuation. That is, it has to involve a theory of how the human individual subject is formed as a subject. And in short, this individuation of subjects demands resources that can't be integrated into a model of calculative efficiency, into a market economy. But as Chatelet explains in great detail, and Chatelet is a mathematician, and he's very analytic in his approach to this question, neoliberal economics actually begins with a disavowal of this difference. It takes as its first principle individualism. In other words, the theoretical fiction of a society of fully formed, fully independent agents who meet in the market, who are in principle symmetrical in nature, and whose interaction is then limited to an exchange of information. And this exchange of information in turn is supposed to be sufficient in itself to equilibrate society, so society in a sense would emerge from the interplay of these individual nodes. And there's the imposition of this supposedly natural order, then, for Chatelet, that's the sovereign task of what he calls the neoliberal counter-reformation. React swiftly to shifts in its opinions, ultimately making politics scarcely more than a facsimile of the market itself. So this is what Chatelet talks about as cyber politics, a painless scientific management of the social, which places its trust in self-organization and the spontaneous emergence of optimal outcomes. And if it does intervene at all, then it intervenes only to modulate these signals and to ensure optimization and what he calls consensual engineering. Crucially for Chatelet, what he predicts will complete and consummate this process and close in on the kind of absolute zero of politics is what he calls a microphysics of obedience, or a neurocratic regime. So he foresees an alliance between politics and cybernetics that extends the model of market individualism into the brain itself, into the fabrication of behaviours, producing what he calls tapeworm citizens who are proud to be free of the perplexing questions of politics and who exult in the smoothness of so-called clear communication, whose aim is to come as close as possible to liquidity. So at the limit then, for Chatelet, human brains become nothing but a surface of inscription for a system that demands circulation and the extraction of value, and its subjects become a kind of passive relay. The argument of the book then is, if contrary to the fiction of ready-made individuals primed for this market of information, we consider that subjects are the historical product of the social and technical milieu in which they're formed, then we can see this process as in fact the production of a new type of subject whose expectations, interactions, and forms of attention are shaped via technology, by the market alone, and which therefore expect nothing more of life than survival in this virtual pasture. That is, subjects who live and think like pigs, although he does open the book with an apology to pigs. And philosophically, I relate this to Bernard Stiegler's work on individuation, and the strongest statement perhaps that Stiegler issues on this question of individuation is when he says, "A being that has not been educated, whose attention has not been formed to any extent, does not have a mind." And according to Châtelet, it's not through neglect, but through design, that mindless subjects are being farmed as neuro-livestock, whose cogitations are going to be harvested for profit, as the institutions of attention formation and education are systematically denigrated and replaced by a kind of cognitive dressage that prepares subjects for the market. Okay, I think it's safe to say that without swallowing this bitter pill whole, we can appreciate there's a certain prescience in Châtelet's analysis, and it has certain implications for this juxtaposition of the two farms that John's work gives us. Because the Google farm does indeed have a far more ambiguous relationship to production. That is to say, who is being consumed, what's being produced, what exactly is this factory processing. Of course, we consume information, but we're quite aware that every interaction is being recorded and analysed and harvested. And it's the relation between these systems and ourselves as consumers of service which produces a more disturbing relation where our desires are satisfied and cultivated just enough, perhaps, to ensure a good yield of data. And of course, states now are in fact collaborating with technology companies, looking to render their interactions with their customers more fluid, more interactive, more flexible, and more responsive. So there's no doubt that as far as these algorithms are concerned, individuals simply are de facto reduced to data processing nodes whose dislikes, likes, opinions, etc. can be counted and collated and processed and value extracted from them. So this process has, to say the least, a very vexed relation to the surface, the aesthetic surface, and the affect of interactivity, of sociality, of connectivity, and the apparently empowering quality that these technologies have, especially when, on the side of the processing, really there's a real threshold that's being passed where the management of user responses is being processed at speeds that are far below the threshold of any possible human perception. So there's perhaps a kind of illusion, a kind of persistence of vision here that occludes the density of the algorithmic processing that's going on behind this blank facade, a kind of screening which renders it unreadable and opaque. So this brings us to a final question about these works as works of art and their relation to so-called post-internet art. Because presumably contemporary art is supposed to, in some sense, present us with an image of our contemporaneity, and raises the question of how we can picture these massively complex socio-technical processes, and what role does a certain invisibility of production and the aesthetic inaccessibility of these complex operations play in this. There's a kind of impossibility of any kind of cognitive mapping of these processes. So that's really the central question: what does the internet look like? And I wouldn't suggest that John's work here provides us with a comprehensive answer to that question. In fact, in a sense, the blankness of this facade, of this strange facility in the middle of nowhere, only goes to intensify this feeling of opacity, this screening, this unavailability of the real processes. And I think its literalism and its hyper-representationalism is significantly different from the genre of post-internet art and addresses the question in a different way. So finally, in this sense, I see this whole question as relating to what the American philosopher Wilfrid Sellers calls the scientific and the manifest image of the human, possibly the most fundamental disarticulation at play here. And you could call it a tale of two portraits. On one hand, what these data centers are constructing is a portrait of human collectivity generated and garnered from statistical analysis and from algorithmic loops. It's being assembled and deployed literally at light speed. And then we have our own self-portrait, our own sense of a legacy image of what the human individual is, of their needs, of their desires, and their modes of interaction. And one, I think we can say, is certainly being instrumentalized by the other. This, after all, is the whole meaning of personalization, which appeals to our spontaneous sense of ourselves. But we have to ask whether our spontaneous grasp of ourselves as subjects hasn't become hopelessly inadequate to the systems that are reformatting us as individuals and as social collectives today. So we have with us tonight 4 speakers who I think will bring very different and complementary perspectives to bear on these questions. Adam Kleinman is a writer and curator, editor of the online magazine Wit to Bit Review, and a former documenter agent, which I think is even more shady than a KGB agent. And much of his current work, I think, involves research in new ways in which artworks can address this digital reality beyond its surface aesthetics. Benedict Singleton, whose work in design and strategy involves often working with technology companies to envision how shifts in technology and their social consequences change the nature of service design and provision, and who's written extensively on design, intelligence, and the future. Jay Owens, whose work involves research into the social and political impact of social media and the way in which users perceive and employ these platforms, and how they negotiate issues around security, privacy, and personalization. And Matthew Fuller, who's a professor at the Centre for Cultural Studies at Goldsmiths here in London, and teaches media and software studies in particular. Who's also made some very probing works that look beneath the surface of our everyday interaction with data and work directly with algorithms and software. So I'm going to turn to Matt first. You've been making work related to these things really before the internet proper existed, I think. And they've constantly, I think, tried to break through this surface of interaction to other alternative views onto the data. And without trying to get nostalgic about this, I think you're probably of about the same generation as I was. And when we first got home computers, in order to make them do anything, you had to know something about them. Which is, I mean, for us, looking back on that, it's a massive contrast. Because now with the interface being incredibly slick and kind of impermeable, this surface has got more multi-layered and more opaque. And in one of the papers, right about Google personalization, we talk about it as being a powerful but opaque machine. And so the question is really a difficult question, how we even get a grasp on this, this machine, never mind making an image of it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. I think it's probably a question that Google are asking themselves as well, in certain ways. As I think within the company there are many different factions looking at that. And what I wanted to do is try to set out a couple of ways in which we can look at this kind of question from the point of view of the genealogy of such technologies. The first I wanted to say it's actually kind of nice to speak about event where you don't feel like you're contributing to gentrification for a change. You know, perhaps bringing down the tone a little. So, if we live in an era of official openness, we can see this in a number of ways, the kind of government rhetoric about open data, transparency of policy, of the way in which decision-making is presented as clear and for the benefit of populations. There's the rhetoric of it at the level of governance, so openness and transparency at the level of governance, but there's also this this parallel development of a proliferation of what are called black sites. And I think both of these cases that John Gerrard has isolated are examples of black sites. So black sites are the inverse of transparency. And in a way they're interesting because they mirror something that Gilles Châtelet talks about when he talks about the kind of lost spaces of the 60s, where he talks about spaces sheltered from immediate social demand. So spaces that are outside scrutiny, spaces that are outside the immediate demands of social conformism or capital and so on. And so black sites are something like you know, Salo in Pasolini's film, or they're like Google's server farms. They're like these pig farms as isolated. They're off-map, they're blurred in Google Earth. Many of them would be military sites. And they also exist at a micro scale in the black squares of redaction. So things that are hidden from the documents that you find leaked by Edward Snowden, or the things that are blocked out of official reports as they're leaked into the National Archive or published by the National. So the black site is the alter ego of contemporary transparency. So when Robin's talking about the neoliberal structures of information processing, or the market being key information processor in the ideal of the neoliberal market, one of the key aspects of this structure is the idea of transparent market, but it also involves asymmetries of information. So what we're looking at here, in a sense, is the way in which information constitutes polities. Access to information constitutes kinds of politics and kinds of space, but it is also fundamentally to do with asymmetries, with the difference between blackness, opacity, and transparency. And we think of the architectural rhetoric of transparency is something manifest in Google's recently proposed headquarters, these massive glass tents that repeat some of the become more radical architectural movements of the 60s. Apple's headquarters, which includes server farms that are entirely run on green energy, also transparent, this massive investment in sheets of glass which had to be manufactured in entirely new factories. They were so big because they wanted the rhetoric of transparency. At the same time, these entities, these new corporate headquarters, are fortresses of openness. So the automated meat farm, the Google server farm, also have their kinship with things like the Horniman Square police torture site in Chicago. In a state of generalized transparency, we can say that black boxes have become essential for the maintenance of power. At the same time, we have this very interesting condition also that Robin mentioned, is in order to maintain this asymmetry, individuals are woven in at a fundamental level. So individuals become the site in which both transparency is operating and black sites are operating. So at the same time as we're agents of transparency, we're also agents of opacity. And certainly psychoanalysis would have a lot about this. So within this kind of condition, we can see entities or agents such as Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, and others. Julian Assange, who's not so far from here in his own black box. In a sense, acting out a way in which individuation, a certain kind of individuation occurs in between the overlap of black boxes and transparency as individuals move out of one zone and into another. So the whistleblower is a kind of exemplary form of individual that kind of defeats, in a sense, Châtelet's argument about the kind of human human maggots writhing around in the slime of their own information. Although that sounds like a good night out. So I'm trying to think, okay, with this kind of context, where does the difference, where does the kind of historical root of the conflict between transparency and the black box come about? And one of the deep historical roots is the conflict between cybernetics and behaviorism. So cybernetics historically comes after behaviorism. Behaviorism reaches its kind of apotheosis in the 20s and 30s. To the 40s, the idea was that the organism or the social entity could be treated as a black box. This is where the term comes from. And nothing could be known, essentially, about the inner workings of an organism. All that could be you simply observe the outside, and on that basis, on the basis of behavior, something brought into recent economics through behavioral economics, you observe the behavior of the entity or the agent, and from there on you can model, reproduce. Cybernetics, in a sense, tried to break open the box, tried to reproduce through experimental robots or experimental computers such as the homeostat, the idea of self-organizing entities or entities that had an internality that could be modeled and could be generative. So in a sense, transparency is something brought to us by cybernetics. Black box is the model of the world brought about by behaviorism. What's interesting is that in contemporary political and economic thought, there's a kind of merger between the two. Populations are treated as entities that can be handled as behaviorist black boxes. At the same time, they're interfaced and regulated and introduced into each other through cybernetically modeled networks. So some of the genealogy of this would be technologies that are established in order to structure the language of interaction between abstractly modeled entities, such as game theory, one of the kind of strategic drivers of the Cold War, Alan Turing's universal Turing machine, specifically as a machine that was designed to model all other possible symbolic machines, and the way in which this allowed for further modeling of things such as networks, black boxes, transparent interactions, but also all systems of codification as they came in combination with each other and also with things such as capital. But each of these provides different kinds of problems, different kinds of models of transparency, of the movement of power, and relationship between transparency and asymmetries of opacity. The way in which these systems have developed over time has been, first of all, to provide, in the case of the kind of databases running, to take the example of the kind of databases running on these server farms that we're looking at, first of all, you have kinds of databases that emerge in around the 1960s to 1970s, the relational database. Most of you will have a copy of this on your computer, the MySQL database, which essentially provides very strict grid-like tabular relations between objects. What we find now is a much more abstract set of relations between things in new forms of databases called NoSQL databases. The World Wide, current version of the World Wide Web is based around. So all dynamic websites, all social media are based around websites which work on the basis of a destroyed structure, a very empty, abstract structure, which can be, which data can be thrown into without any apparent order. So in a way that the technology mirrored the growth of the technology that we're looking at behind these walls, in a sense, mirrors the kind of critique that Châtelet is trying to make. So Châtelet tries to say that in the 60s, there was this movement of creative expression, of counterculture, of exuberant movements of liberation, which shattered tabular structures, which shattered kind of molar forms of organization and hierarchical forms of organization, putting into play network forms of organization along the lines of critique offered by capitalism and others. What we have essentially here is a technology that allows this to take place, but it allows it to take place in a way that it can be captured. And this is what is significant, I think, in the way that Robin's been introducing this talk, is this way in which there's a close mirroring between the technology that is there, that is sufficiently abstract to capture any kind of data that's thrown at it, and is also capable of working on such a massive scale. So if we think in terms of the shifts of the way in which art has dealt with these kind of questions, if the net art of the 1990s tried to crack open the black box, to get inside the innards of servers, of networks, to work at the levels of code and to disrupt and reorganize networks, to introduce disruptive elements of disruptive visualizations into networks, into search engines, in the work of groups such as Mongrel or Jody and many others. There's a kind of strong correlation also to what we now see in hacking. The work of art in the present moment attempting to deal with this kind of context is very much to do with how surfaces interface and how different modalities of surface move in and out of these network forms. So again, there's a kind of reiteration of opacity and transparency, but primarily to do with the way in which images are circulating, which images are constructed. So it's a given, in a sense, in the present art around the internet, or around the infrastructure around the internet, that opacity is accepted, in a sense. Whereas the art of the 90s was very much about trying to crack that. So, in a sense, what I wanted to kind of map out was these kind of states of asymmetric movements from transparency to black boxes, and in a way in which the black box and transparency becomes a generalized ethos, a generalized mode of behavior at the level of individuals, at the level of organizations, and as we can see in this artwork very well, the level of infrastructural formation. Okay, thanks.
So in a sense, the server farm is an opaque black box for us, but we might also be a black box for it, because it essentially doesn't have all that much interest in what's going on inside. If it can, as a scientist friend of mine says, poke and measure. I think that's a perfect point to pass over to Jay, since in your work you are concerned with individuals, people, and the way in which they use these media, in particular social media. So presumably you have the opportunity to see the user, or you intend to see the user in a far less passive light than we might have suggested with Châtelet. And yet there's surely a certain fact that can't be denied. There is this disparity of power between these algorithms running below the level of human perception and our self-image and the way we interact with them. So isn't necessarily a relation of exploitation here, or does it run both ways?
That's a fascinating and very difficult question. I don't think I would claim to have anything approaching some sort of kind of answer. And really what I just want to sort of say here is just some ways in which we might sort of complexify and sort of met this idea of cybercattle. What else are social media users? Where do we see people expressing agency? Where do we see them at the limits of their agency, or unable to act and to be free and to do what they might want to do? And so that user agency is an interesting theme. How far do we have it? And I think in the second part, maybe responding to this idea of the Google data center as this sort of repository of all this value taken out of people's social media behavior, taken out of their search behavior, and this vast, the repository of Google's wealth, in a sense. I'm also quite interested in, you're coming from the business side of social data research. I work for Pulsar, which is a startup that's built a social media research platform. So on the one hand, professionally, I'm in business of trying to make money out of what people are doing on the internet, to make sense out of it, and to put it incredibly crudely. It's not what's written on my LinkedIn portfolio, let's say that. But on the one hand, I'm trying to make money out of data. On the other hand, as a ultimately biggest market researcher, and a user researcher, I'm trying to understand what people want and what they think, and really within the process of marketing and product development within corporate clients, I'm sort of the user advocate who argues this is what they think, this is what they want, this is what they need, and here are some of them in a workshop or co-creation session, and trying to get real people and real needs and their worldview actually more completely recognised. So none of that produces answers, none of that produces a single worldview of what kind of thing social media or social data is, but it hopefully exposes some sort of interesting tensions and complexities. And I think to start off to respond to this, when we try to ask what sort of thing social data is, there are so many different scales at which we can look at this. And this is the sort of the most, the biggest really, the most infrastructural and the most material. It's the backbone of the internet. It's like looking at a picture of a power plant or a factory. And if we look at a power plant, we see something very unhuman and something like quite alien and something we don't feel we control. If we look at somebody sort of switching on a light, or a person being kept on a ventilation in a hospital that's running on electricity, we get a very, very different view of what kind of thing electricity is. And so much the same with the internet. You know, we've mentioned post-internet art and other guises, and that can look at much more level of surface aesthetics. We've got people working on sort of net art, vague wave, unfashionable Tumblr movements, looking at corporate aesthetics and trying to get it in from that angle. You've got people trying to do affect and the feel of being a social media user and the user experience, and then of course sort of data-driven art. And whichever one of those four levels you look at, you come to some quite different answers. So thinking a bit about agency then, coming from my sort of professional perspective, I'm interested in understanding what do people think about the business model that's been taken for their social media use, and what, you know, do people understand the business model? And on the one hand, I think we have this kind of black box situation where do people understand how Google makes all its money? Do we understand all of the data points that are taken from our social media behaviour? To which the answer is absolutely not. And that would support the black box thesis. On the other hand, though, we might argue that our social media use is really much the same as, let's say, Channel 4. It is the exchange of advertising for free access to a service. It's an exchange of your attention watching those advertisements for something that you might find entertaining and enjoyable. And that's a fairly simple user model. And do people maybe conceptualise their use of social media through that? Could be more plausible. I think there's then a question of, if we're talking about social media use, I mean, from obviously Châtelet, we know that we can't talk very straightforwardly about, you know, individuals in a market making a decision, you know, as equal agents with Google to swap their information. But we can ask, you know, do people feel they get some sort of value exchange from social media usage? And I think there's some interesting sides from behaviour when we look at, you know, are people trying to move away from Facebook? Are they trying to move away from Twitter, from Instagram, and so on? Where, I mean, one of the first points is, of course, that most people don't use Twitter in particular. One of the sites with the most transparent model of how its data can be shared through an API and made private. It's sort of, you know, the percentage of the population using that regularly, less than 10% are highly active users, creating regular status updates and so on. Most people don't find value in these things and correspondingly don't use them. Among those of us who do, we've had, about every year or so, there becomes an alternative social media site, Elo earlier this year, at the end of last year, Diaspora a couple of years ago, who very explicitly position themselves as offering social networking, all of the social advantages of that, and the ability to communicate, but in non-profit models, in distributed models, and a much more, an ethical Twitter and ethical Facebook. And people don't, and those have not got traction, and they have not, everybody in my sort of corner of Twitter moved to Elo when that launched. It wasn't that even there, it's not the argument that there's network effects where you can't start using these platforms because there's nobody there. Among my particular social network, everybody was still there, and yet we still didn't stick. That advantage of not being exploited economically didn't seem to have enough value compared to the other kinds of value we get from Twitter. And the kind of value I get from Twitter, I have my job, I found my job through it. It's delivered, personally speaking, I get thousands of pounds of value from that. And if asked what would I pay for a subscription to get all that I could from Twitter, the answer is in hundreds of pounds a year quite easily. And I may not be a entirely free subject. I'm a consumer. I'm informed. I live in capitalism. My desires and my ability to assess value are constrained by all of that. But nonetheless, personally speaking, I perceive I get value, and I think I want to hold that up against French philosophers in their ivory towers who want to call me cybercattle or sheeple or something like that. I might respectfully disagree with them. And I think a third part of this agency point is understanding that we don't have total freedom, but yet within the confines of social media systems, there's endless user creativity and finding workarounds and hacks and ways of creating some kind of balance, some kind of equilibrium between the privacy you need and yet also the publicity or the ability to talk to other people. So great work from Don Boyd and Zeynep Tufekci on people's behaviour, teenagers on Facebook whitewalling, putting up a status update, deleting it the day after, leaving no long-standing value traces, but still getting that benefit of being able to share messages with their friends. People using fake names, fake genders, fake dates of birth, and relying on their offline networks to verify who they are, while being actually opaque to the systems in those ways. People using ad blockers, of course, in social media. People having multiple social media accounts, having throwaway email addresses. Subtweets, the ability for people to post what they want to say through posting images of text rather than searchable text itself. And in all these sort of micro technologies, all these micro little ways we have of making ourselves less visible, and still yet being able to use social sites to keep in touch with friends far away, to get news, to be able to be part of social formations we want to. And it's not balance, it's not equilibrium, it's not fair, it's not none of those things exactly, but people find ways of sort of creating the space they need and trying to be the person that they want to be, and that's an agency. That's another area to consider here, if I still have time. It's the problem of getting value from social data, and coming again from the perspective of, if only it was so easy to get value out of social data. It is a far messier and far more opaque medium than it might seem. Status updates make sense in social context, and without the social context, without people, without knowing why somebody has tweeted that, without knowing what else has gone on in their life, with who their friends are, what those people know about them, the vast majority of those Twitter status updates are actually very, very difficult to read. It's very difficult to say what is that person's intent, what are they seeking to communicate. It is the proportion of Twitter updates, you might actually be able to get some very clear information that you could serve an advert against. This person likes Coca-Cola, this person is trying to buy a new car. The proportion that actually carry that kind of clear, passable information that you can get advertising value out of is very, very small. It's a fraction of 1%. And while Facebook might certainly be profiting from our social data, they made, I think, over $3 billion per quarter in 2014. And Twitter made about $300 million in Q3 2014, I believe. They're certainly profiting, but that's revenue that all comes from advertising. And if we look at the attitude of advertisers to whether they're getting value from advertising social media, it's far, far, far more opaque and more complex. That brands are very, very skeptical, actually. There's a sense that you have to be using social media because your competitors are, and because it's the future, because how do you reach young people who are watching less TV? There's a sense of panic and maybe a panic-driven need to be on there to keep up with the Joneses, as it were. But the statistics on the kind of response you get from social media advertising are essentially dreadful. The click-through rate on Facebook on advertising content is 0.14%. The cost for 1,000 impressions to show adverts to 1,000 people is 75 cents, because nobody does anything as a response being shown an advert. And there are realms of planners and strategists in ad agencies trying to find, to do return on investment studies that show somehow that the hundreds of millions of pounds a big brand might, hundreds of millions, hundreds of thousands of pounds a big brand might spend on Facebook advertising had actually gone and done anything in the real world. But making that value case is not trivial, and I mean sometimes it works, but quite often it's as much a matter of faith as a matter of evidence. And so we see analysts such as Forrester's Nate Elliott, makes a recommendation that brands no longer see Facebook as a viable marketing channel. We're seeing analysts predict that actually companies will walk away potentially from Facebook advertising. General Motors withdrew $10 million in advertising in 2012. Are they an early adopter on that side? And that really Facebook, all of the data, all of the ability to target by interest, all of the ability supposedly to find customers willing to buy your product, none of that data adds up to that promise, and Facebook simply becomes a broadcast advertising medium where you buy simple impressions exactly as you do with TV advertising. So that link between data and value is much more difficult than it seems in the business and economic sense. And this isn't even to get into advertising fraud, which is basically hilarious, where you've got problems. 50% of web traffic to publishers is not people at all, but bots. You get into the idea, you're mentioning or gesturing at the idea of programmatic ad buying, where within a website, the idea is there's fantastic data targeting, and the fact that a particular known individual has turned up on a web page, that different advertisers will bid to show that person an advert, and that within sort of 0.1 seconds, one of those advertisers has bid more money and will be the one that shows them that advert, because they know something about the individual and perceive it's more valuable to them to advertise them. But within programmatic ad buying, again, there's a huge amount of fraud, that people block cookie tracking, that the cookies don't match up to the actual user behavior, that you're still showing it to bots about 20% of the time. And really, in all these ways, the business model seems to be really a sort of house of sand. It's built on very, very shaky foundations. And Facebook are indeed making a lot of money from it. Not to deny that there's value extraction there, but it looks a very solid thing when we see data centers. It looks a very solid thing when we see Google showing headquarters. But this is as tenuous as the City of London. It's something that can rise very fast and perhaps collapse.
So on one hand, there's a kind of bubble effect where perhaps this value is not quite as robust as we think, and on the other hand, there is a certain amount of agency, there's a certain amount of space within these platforms for manoeuvre. And I think Benedict's written and spoken extensively on this concept of the platform, and a lot of the clients you're working with them, what we've seen over the last decade is the shift from services to in the role played by the users of services, right? So we're familiar enough with the general kind of claim that speed and connectivity enable a far more fine-grained interaction between the service and its clients or company and its customers. And we've seen various scenarios where users make an unexpected use or misuse of the software platform, which is then adopted by the software company and actually drives growth and expansion. But from the service provider's point of view, how does that kind of scenario change the game? And how does it perhaps add a bit of colour to this image of the evil empire and its cultivating its cybercattle?
Yeah, okay. Firstly, that's true. I mean, people banding around turn platforms a lot in design, which is where I work for my sins, commercial work anyway. And the idea of the platform has been driven into kind of popular discourse around businesses, and, especially by the growth of big digital platforms, absolutely. Facebook and Google being kind of paradigmatic of that. But it's actually quite a curious thing if you think about what these people are doing. So think about it not in terms of kind of just building a technology, but like actually what an organisation is trying to do with that. So it actually, building a platform is kind of a alternative strategy to what 50 years ago would have been formulating a plan. People had these incredibly elaborate plans about what their business was going to do over 5 years, 10 years, and this kind of thing. Indeed, having business plans is still necessary to get small business loans and all that kind of thing. And with the platform, what you're trying to do is effectively formulate a plan that relies on the unexpected in order to work. So you build something, and then you invite people to take it up in whatever way, and as Joe was so eloquently explaining, you hope that there's some way that you can recapture that. And this produces these sort of confusing things where, as Matt was saying, actually, like 90s net art narratives around, hackers and this kind of thing start to become a little bit dubious because the appropriation is being invited right from the beginning. And it's certainly incomprehensible to business press, because when you look at things like on Facebook, try to do a William Kennedy-led ad campaign around being like a chair, as have images of auditoriums and empty seats and things like that, and say, well, Facebook just brings people together and we don't know what's going to happen. So in the context of Facebook trying to cultivate what they, to use an almost farming metaphor, cultivate what they call the next billion users, which is largely in kind of Africa and parts of Asia. And they don't really have a plan for that. They're just kind of like, well, we have another billion people on Facebook and we'll find some way to make money out of it. People are using ways we can't expect and so on. So valuing it in terms of being open in a narrow way towards contingency. So obviously this is pretty confusing to try and get our heads around, as is this whole sort of caboodle, basically. These systems with kind of black boxes and layer after layer of interfaces and so on. It's presented so well here in John Gerrard's work. And I tend to think that this necessitates a different way of going about thinking these things. And I guess this is not exactly commercial, extra commercial work. It's largely just about, because I'm a designer by background, how things get done in the first place. And it turns out we don't actually know very much about this at all. The idea that having a philosophy of technology in a formal way has only been around since 1867 or so. And we largely, the condemnation of factory systems and philosophies of technology are very much about, oh, well, the unsophisticated ones are kind of like, we're being mechanized and turned into cybercattle. And the slightly more sophisticated ones are like, it's not as simple as that. But there's kind of no way to cut through those sort of things. So in work that I was doing back a while ago now, I suppose, but still kind of continuing the project, I was looking at actually the design of human behavior explicitly, in the sense that, I was a designer, I was working for companies, design companies that were designing services and organizations and indeed platforms that later on that start to be called. And thinking, like, well, this is actually people whose job it is to build artifacts, and they're now trying to build services, which in their minimal form, you just have one person, another person, one person act on the other's behalf, and you have a service. Or an organisation with whatever degree of complexity, but you, nonetheless, you say, well, you are actually kind of designing behaviour in this sense, and this is designers sitting, lending their skills within our materials and so on to human beings. And I was kind of interested in why this was such a taboo subject. Lawyers or economists or moral philosophers or psychiatrists or could make these kind of normative statements about how people should be around each other, and why couldn't design. And the immediate prospect is, in a very kind of Châtelet style that perhaps not quite so sophisticated, that to do so is to treat people as things, is to treat people as commodities, or however you want to frame it. It's a reductionist way of looking at human behaviour as purely a kind of material geometry to be arranged. It's associated with all kinds of hideous domination and this kind of thing. Which is true, but actually the way that people talk about that only turns up with the advent of the factory, really. And a lot of the philosophies of technology that I was previously doubting will, draw back like older examples of like kind of the roots of where the rot's set in. So they'll talk about, say, Descartes and the idea that, living creatures are machines and this sort of thing. What they kind of miss out of that context is before the Industrial Revolution, to be compared to a machine, a complex machine is a very hackneyed human achievement, basically, in practical sense. And there was, in fact, an entirely different, now almost entirely lost understanding of design not being about imprinting, kind of, as I say, some sort of material geometry on the world considered as a passive thing, but as a kind of cunning and indirect way of achieving effects through various roundabout means, which still lingers on in English. I think various other languages won't get into it. But when we take words which have a neutral sense with design, so things like a plot, a kind of drawing or scheme, or the word craft, and then apply them to human beings, and they become plotting and scheming and crafting and so on. This history goes all the way back. Actually, it's curious you mentioned cybernetics and the root words, being steersman. People often don't think about the kind of intelligence that goes into being a steersman, which is not a homeostatic, just trying to keep things level thing, but constantly contending with contingency and having to negotiate an ambiguous and sometimes hostile environment and this kind of thing. And you can actually trace this, at least in Western tradition, understanding of what design is about, all the way back to certainly to Plato and before, Homer, I suppose. But anyway, to jump back to where we are now, the platform I think is interesting because it offers a kind of case study of this kind of intelligence at work, where you're not trying to directly say people are going to do this, but you're offering some kind of structure for people to take up and make their own. And a platform has to be a reliable thing, a dependable thing, otherwise people won't use it. Otherwise it can't be taken up into our everyday practices. So it produces reliance and dependence correspondingly, and various kinds of subtle insinuations in the way that it shapes the way that people appropriate things. And I'm sure I've spoken long enough. I think that this is something that we have to contend with, and as a final point on Châtelet, I guess, his position on this. He was certainly kind of prescient, I guess, in talking about, the culture. Let's use a nice word like cultivation or something of populations in order to kind of like harness data from it and produce value, however you see that it's conceived. And it's a Jeremiah, like he's not very happy about this at all. And he was quite prescient, but he was also, I think, inadvertently prescient with the response to it, which is largely he doesn't have one. And the diagnosis is far more sophisticated than the prescription. At the end, he just says, we have to do better than Hegel and Marx, because that's not going to help us here. And I think that's true. And what we need is just more sophisticated ways of thinking about these things, and the way in which we can understand ourselves as complicit with them, colluding with them, and their kind of reversibility. That, as Jay was saying, companies are trying to make money out of this, and it's not happening. At the same time, people are saying, it's giving data to the internet and so on. But rather than being overwhelmed by the complexity here and taking up a cheap nihilism or a kind of blasé, like, it'll be fine, I think we need to get into those kinds of logics and collusion and complicity and start to unpick them, which, from my point of view, things like very old understanding design help me to do. I'm not positive that's a solution, but at least it starts to give you something of limits that this may be possible.
I saw Matthew was feverishly taking notes, and we'll come back to possible disagreements. But I'd like to turn lastly to Adam, and perhaps to talk a little bit about this relationship between subject and subjectivation, and how these mechanisms of power, however we see them, are or aren't represented in so-called post-internet art. I admit to being a bit confused about what this term means, because a lot of the time it seems to mean taking your Tumblr and putting it into a gallery or something like this, or kind of an intensification or an acceleration of this torrent of digital images that we are dealing with. Without, I don't know whether it's telling us anything new about them. So is it a coherent classification, or is it just a label of convenience? And if post-internet art doesn't answer the question, what does the internet look like, then what other strategies are there for probing that question a bit deeper?
Thanks, Robin. I'm not apologizing. I'm spatially configured in a very weird way where I'm destined to put my back to everyone or someone, which is kind of like a Japanese garden, which I guess would be my metaphor for having me. And thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for having me here. To address your first question, which is, I guess, the origins and use of post-internet art, which is not a term I prefer. I will eschew any moral judgments, but you can read any implications you want of how I explain events. The rough and crude thing is it's a term invented by an artist named Marissa Olson, which was to simply state the fact that it is art created after the internet, not necessarily art for the internet. That said, it picked up like a meme, which is what's sort of playing into it, and in some sense it's working like a marketing term. Of course, value judgments and just kind of sussing things out. However, if you look at it, or what is generally termed in it, and I don't like generalizations, I like looking at actual works and talking specifically about artists and their specific works instead of groups, but for ease of sake, go into it a little bit. In particular, it's art that can or cannot be defined by interests in social connectivity and affect, as you've mentioned, and as we mentioned, through screen effects and surface effects. To that end, I would actually say the reason why its popularity exists is because it already existed before. And if you look in the annals of art, these ideas of social networks and connectivity were originally defined by people like Pierre Bourdieu and were already developed in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s in various forms of art making, be it institutional critique, be it the pictures generation, and so on and so forth. I particularly key in on the pictures generation because a lot of the styles of Photoshop, which it developed from the use of artists, and there's a reason why it's called Photoshop, of course, is it's parodying or copying or using or updating or 2.0, whatever metaphor you want, of basically what was always called appropriation, which again is an old art that's been around for, if you want to go back to collage, almost a century. If you want to go back to just simply the idea of artists reinterpreting previous works, that goes back millennia. In particular, the reason why I pull this out, and I don't mean to pick on anyone, I did say that I do like to talk about specific artists and specific artwork, so I'm not making an example out of someone. But Amelia Allman is someone who's become one of the poster boys or poster girls, sorry for the gender, but that's actually part of the reason, because she's created a Tumblr feed in which she's supposedly exploiting gender bias in roles. I'm not going to say it's good art or bad art, I'm going to say it's incredibly similar to Cindy Sherman. And maybe that's why it's already instantly received, because, and this is my bigger point, because we already have a vocabulary to understand it. And that becomes a little dangerous to me because you're starting to go a little towards dogma, or you're getting towards not really thinking about what you're doing. As I won't say an antidote, but I can say kind of art I'm looking at that involves things that we call computers or things that we call internet and so on and so forth. And unlike those, as we Rob and I have been talking a little bit, I've been talking about this concept of literalness or literality. We can get into that later, but what I'd like to actually suppose is, yes, there's the metaphor, and I highly agree, and I think it's very important about the ideas of opacity, the ideas of translucency, which we forgot, and transparency. But more importantly, those are metaphors, and those metaphors are stuck. I'm eschewing the narrative history, of course, of the behavioralists and cybernetics, but linguistically, this is a sort of stem that is contained in a very hermetic form of language, right? And that's fine, that's good, it's useful for whatever you need. However, there's also a thing called vantage. There's also a thing called perspective, and being someone interested in art, I'm interested in these things. And the perspective of these things can radically change their meaning. You can be behind the screen in some ways it's very useful. You can be behind the screen in ways it's very bad. And what I'm looking at now, and maybe it's a slight metaphor, so excuse me, is works that are both behind, on, or in front of the screen. And these are concepts that exist. But more importantly, what is your spatial relationship to these phenomena, and how does that spatial relationship affect your livelihood or your work or whatever. So, and to this end, I tend to not really work with what is necessarily called so-called Western, or so on or so forth. So I'll leave with one little question, is to this end, yes, we've been talking about Facebook, yes, we've been talking about social networks and whatever. The media is the same, but is a message that goes out by a YPG fighter, or is a message that goes out by a Daesh fighter the same thing, even though they travel on the same network and are still believed by the same people and have the same affect used in criticism?
We're kind of already running out of time, basically, but we're going to take any questions that the audience has, but I'd just like to ask Matthew, you seem like you wanted to respond a bit to Benedict, and I feel like, strangely, you were the lone voice on Chatelet's side here, which is kind of not what I expected in a way. But what was your response to this, this suggestion that somehow the transparency can maybe win out over the black box if we adopt a more cunning, collusive, complicit way of thinking about our position vis-a-vis these systems?
Yeah, I guess what I was interested in was the question of, most of the discussion has talked about we as if we know what it is. It's a very easy thing to pull apart. But the idea that the agency remains unchanged when it's within different technical contexts. I think we need to think about technologies as having inherent, as in the way we look at specific artworks, we look at specific technologies as having specific kinds of agency, particular kinds of grammar that compose different kinds of social and aesthetic forms, and that in a sense produce different kinds of society. If we think, if we go back to Gilles Chatelet's work, one of the people he collaborated with often was Felix Guattari, and in Guattari's book, Lines of Flight, he talks about the way in which different social eras, different historical eras are determined in some way, or have important roles are played by the kinds of equipment that are used. And he talks about equipment in two senses. One is the technical sense, and one is in the way in which, in French, équipe is a team. And so the equipment is the stuff that brings you together collectively. And that means also that your self changes. So in the sense, if we talk about, when we talk about whether Facebook is good or bad, it doesn't, it's a kind of irrelevant, it's an irrelevant vocabulary to be used. It's the sense of good or bad that is often played in this discourse is something we need to evacuate as a discourse and think about what is the mode of society, what is the mode of culture that we're entering into the moment in which, as we've heard, 20% of interaction is by bots, at the very least. What is the mode of economy? For instance, we're in St. James's, the highest concentration of hedge funds operating in Europe are in this very small amount of space in London. What is the mode of economy in which agency is held by the algorithms run by these entities? What is the form of subjectivity that these algorithms operate by? How does that connect to human or so-called human modes of society? What do crashes mean when they're technologically precipitated? What does it mean that our desires are accelerated and intensified by bubbles and also by the grammars of interaction that compose us and which we're acting in? I think that's the level at which to ask this question. I think Chatelet has a very kind of acerbic take on it and doesn't really address the kind of computational mode in which it's happening in the present. But I think this is the reason why his work is very crucial.
So, can we answer any of these questions, Joe, from empirical data or from what users tell us? Can we learn anything about how these this technical equipment transforms subjects from the point of view of the user, rather than kind of theorizing about it in a general way?
I can have a go, I think, at responding. Let's try, right? And I think the case study I might want to look at here is Tumblr, which I think is a sort of a brilliant site, one of the slightly smaller social networks, and particularly visually engaged one. As I mentioned earlier, one that some of my best friends have turned Tumblrs into gallery shows. But it's also got a particular mode of having community that I think is very, very valuable, and one of the most interesting spaces really for the formation of subjectivity in the social web at the moment. And it might be owned by Yahoo, but the monetization on Tumblr is really quite a very, very elementary scale at this point in time. And to me, Tumblr is heir really to LiveJournal, which is one of the early blogging platforms, one of the early online communities, which, I mean, speaking personally, I grew up in that. I've been online since I was about 8 or 9. I'm one of the sort of older end of digital natives in some sense. And so my own subjectivity is something I understand as formed through LiveJournal communities, the people I've met there, and that ability to undertake in particularly engaged, multi-threaded dialogue with a series of diverse, older, better educated people from around the world. And I learned from that, and that shaped who I've become. Now, on Tumblr, we see, particularly, I think, within sort of activist communities, using it as a place for people to really come to consciousness of particular facets of identity. Trans identity is one that's Tumblr I think plays an important role for that community. That the idea of being transsexual or being genderqueer is quite a new vocabulary. It's not something people necessarily held as an identity 20 years ago. Even 10 years ago, it meant something a little bit different. And through Tumblr, through the ability to search through tags, through the ability for people to follow others, to reblog and to start conversations, amplifying the work, reblogging and sharing the work of people that we find interesting, inspirational, and adding their own comments on the bottom. Through the ability of Tumblr is an intensely viral network. It's all about circulation and sort of augmentation rather than really people creating original posts. I've done some research on this myself, and we see that well over 90% of content on Tumblr is not new. It's commentary or just people sharing things they like. And through that, it enables the formation of the community, because the original person who made that post, their name is visible. They can see that you've replied to them. It really helps dialogue to break out. It also helps our argument to take place. But it means the communities of people who might be very marginalised within the geographical space they live in, or within the high school that they're part of, are able to find other people like them and to talk about very personal things, almost always through pseudonym-based accounts rather than personal ones. No particular requirement to have user photos or anything that really grounds you too far to the practicalities of what sort of demographic or person or face or whatever you might have. And to share links, to share some quite serious scholars writing on Tumblr, but also to share from your peers and to engage in dialogue with them. And so that enables people to maybe to learn to understand their sexualities, that's to understand their genders, to understand their membership of ethnic minority communities, and to gain pride and to gain a confidence in that was, I think, much harder to achieve perhaps before you were able to find these forms of virtual community. So it's happening this weird sort of roundabout way on Tumblr. That's not the goal of Yahoo, to have created a business that does that, but the dynamics of the space, so things like the reblogs, the comments, all of that structure enables some of that kind of subjectivity to be formed, perhaps.
So these platforms actually potentially are playing the role of these open spaces whose extinction Chatelet was mourning.
But they're also sexual organs that are kind of, they're not just humans using these entities in a way that they would use a sex education manual before. They are enacting sexual activity in a network that is globally accessible and that is accessed by millions. So it's another kind of In the same way that, say, NSA or GCHQ opened up orifices into every one of us through these through their spine, this is the invention of other kinds of sexuality, other kinds of sexual organ, other kinds of sexual entity that include global networks. So it's the human, the good, healthy human becoming a transsexual, or a good, healthy human transsexual, is not the entity we're looking at. We're looking at something which is far more polymorphous. It involves computers, involves bots, involves chemicals, involves networks, and that's what is kind of missing when we talk about being good or bad and kind of defending the use of things, because they're changing the subject that they're using. And if you look at simply humans, that's not what you're getting.
Do you have any questions for the audience?
Yeah, I find it curious that nobody has used the word, and quite interesting, either emotions or feelings during the entire talk, and whether anybody else can speak about anything they were talking about in relation to those two things. Okay,
so why have we talked about emotions, feelings, and affect?
Yeah, you used the word affect, but not emotions.
Yeah.
No one?
No.
I mean, it's interesting that emotion is a key thing that's interesting for value. You know, if we're looking at this kind of question of how do you, if you're a corporate entity looking at whether someone likes your brand, or whether you're a police surveillance agency looking at whether you're emitting hate speech, or whether you're emoting in a bad way in a way that suggests you may go on to commit a crime. Emotion is highly valuable in terms of signifier that can be traded on, whether it's love for a brand or hate that precipitates a riot, or anger that precipitates a riot. These are all things that are highly valuable. So emotion is certainly where something should be looked at.
And surely, actually constructing these platforms, what you're trying to do is to instrumentalize. I mean, this is what you were talking about, Benedict, that you're trying to steer through what's already there, right? You're trying to use emotions, desires.
Sure, and as Matthew was saying, you're not just transparently reproducing these things, you're helping to manufacture them, that kind of thing. And one of the curious things about the sort of emotional aspects of the macro social networks, I guess, put them that way, things like Twitter and Facebook and this kind of thing, where people, really the first round of big social networks where people tend to sign up and have a lot of friends and that kind of thing, is that they are kind of behavioural sinks for certain kinds of emotion, which are often extremely negative, and the anonymity and so on feeds into doxing and trolling and that kind of stuff. And it's curious actually how badly that's been handled, or how unpredictable it seemed to be. I mean, I know it's sort of 90s California ideology that everyone will get along if they're exposed to other people's lifestyles and that kind of stuff, and quite reverse in many corners of the internet. But yeah, there's curious things about, that's a good suggestion by a designer, I can't remember his name, about on Twitter, you could just have something like you should be able to choose on your account to ignore anyone who has less than a certain number of followers when they first approach you, so that people can't harass you and then just set up another account and block them and so on and so forth. And I think that whole thinking of this stuff is kind of like it's not even like a capture thing. It's just an emotion generating substructure, which really, especially when people don't feel, I imagine when people don't feel like immediate responsibility comes back to them, then you kind of off the emotional leash in terms of what you can do. I mean, it's not really my area, but kind of.
Yeah, I mean, it's a whole kind of new landscape of emotional manipulations that can happen on these networks. And it's like Matthew was saying, depending on the equipment, depending on what equipment you're using, it's going to amplify different kinds of effects.
Yeah.
I don't know, I mean,
It's also kind of mischaracterized to say that it's only like that, though, isn't it? Because, you know, Facebook posts lots of pictures of, you know, people with their new babies and
yeah, of course,
people graduating high school and people graduating college. You know, this is kind of like really pleasant kind of everyday background noise.
Yeah, but there's a kind of selective amplification of certain possibilities of interaction.
Yeah, that sort of have their own kind of weird dynamics plugged through us.
But there are two affordances of technology that seem to enable it to become this highly emotively charged space. I mean, one of which being that emotion is sticky. And what you're trying to do is, either as an advertiser or as a platform, you're trying sticky. You talk about sticky content, that where people spend longer on the time, they are stuck. And their eyeballs are sort of open like that, and you can fire more ads into their life. And you want sticky content because you sell more ads against it. And you also want to create what we call engagement, which is basically then somebody clicked on something, somebody shows some kind of interaction with it. And quite strongly, you can see that content that goes viral, the content that gets the most interactions on social platforms is highly emotive. Disgust is a really powerful one. Anything that goes wow, good. We can also love positive stories of human sort of astonishing kindness. These things, the most emotive content is most. Thinking about your interaction online, where each part of your attention, everything gets to be monetized, everything becomes an experience of your attention. And each time you go to a website, you can pay a micropayment of a couple of cents, and each time you might sell your health data to Tesco for, you know, £5 net free. And I'm not sure I want necessarily to live in a social network where I do have more control, but equally I'm making these microtransactions all the time with it. I don't think the kind of emotional subjectivity or the experience between that would feel very good.
And there's a kind of fractioning out as well, isn't there? So these technologies are in their infancy. Probably a couple of the big ones are going to go bust at some point in the next 5 or 10 years. Like just the same as dot-com, you know, there's going to be spectacular failures. But I guess as people get more sophisticated in their own relationships, you can imagine, hypothetically, that people just become more diverse about what kind of things they share. Well, which is already the case, you know, with Twitter and Facebook, people act very differently between the two. But then, you know, multiply that by other things. So apparently people actually use LinkedIn now to talk about wonky stuff. But you know, as these things kind of, you'll end up with, in that situation, you end up with a whole series of layers of different things. Some of that being more readily monetizable than other things. So I don't particularly want a whole bunch of different people to give my location data, you know, to have access to my location data, but with Uber, I mean, so, you know, I'm probably going to make that trade.
But what happens when these kind of systems are paired with governments, like government as a platform, and the kind of move into digital services and providing everything online and so on? Isn't that a kind of key movement? You know, it's really something's changed there. Insofar as, you know, for instance, people who are on the dole have to go online to register and this kind of thing. That these systems have actually, you know, don't have any choice about how you interact, and your data is being used for, you know, this. Your data is being used in these kind of statistical collations and being fed back to you in certain ways. I don't know, do you have an opinion about whether there's a certain limit to how that transformation of public services can proceed?
Well, it's going to happen, isn't it? I think.
Well, I mean, all of this discussion. Yeah, this whole discussion. One of the answers to it is it's all going to happen. We can't do anything about it.
Yeah, well, I think it's not so clear cut, but like certainly in the UK with things like gov.uk, so far as I know, they can't keep any data about you whatsoever. This is a regulatory kind of thing, so you know, the key to this, and they have their they just rolled out the verifying. Kind of like taken for a replace the ID with these data. But what's done about that, I think, is a whole really complex problem that we probably won't solve in the next 5 minutes. Not to like shoot out the question. I'd be really interested in what you guys think about it, but I don't necessarily.
There's a question here.
Hi. I'm just wondering, since there was a lot of talk about statistics and social media, whether that doesn't think that's the case, but whether you think it's a beginning of a new kind of social physics in the way that there's a left is to define it. Now we're trying to find the right amount of data to say. Because for example, you kept referring to statistics, but statistics is something that fundamentally deals with things that are static. And from the static that they are, you use them to sort of predict the future. But when dealing with human beings that are fundamentally not static, and therefore made up of emotions and all of these sort of dynamic processes, isn't there a danger of kind of quantifying things that are categorically impossible to quantify? They're just dealing with qualities. You refer to as sticky subjects, but sticky subject is, you know, so that's just a quantity of, like, you know, the time invested on the screen. Isn't there a danger then to move to kind of social physics where really perverted kind of version where things can be manipulated and controlled?
Yeah, I think Chatelet's point of view is that social physics isn't possible in the sense in which, I mean, he traces it back to Hobbes and the attempt to create a philosophy, a political philosophy on the model of Galilean physics. And obviously for him it's not possible because individuation is a process that, yeah, absolutely can't be quantified. I think a really interesting aspect of that question is whether there's a kind of critical mass or there's a threshold past beyond which the amount of data and the speed at which it can be processed actually enables a completely new way of modelling populations and therefore of controlling them.
I mean, I think Robin's right in the sense that becoming can't be quantified, but quantifications can become. And so there's a way in which numerical quantities, algorithms, other forms of technology that one could say were, if we use a kind of critical theory mode, were reificatory or things that reduce things to quantum. We're looking at modes of mathematics and modes of technology which have a way in which quantifications themselves are engaged in processes of becoming. The whole wave of work in complexity theory, chaos theory, blah, 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 these things that became kind of popular forms. But the way in which, different modes of numbering in themselves have, very unpredictable characteristics. And I think the recent issue of Collapse, to put a plug in on chance, exemplifies this very well, in the sense that numerical forms are not inherently repressive. So in that sense, the return to social physics is something that is quite often brought up in discussions of big data. For instance, is it possible, when you have an understanding of number and of quanta being potentially destructured or non-linear, is it possible to draw out from people's behavior, from behavior of certain datum, a social physics? That's certainly a project that's happening, and there's also the project of how to merge those processes with simulations. So things like agent-based models or social simulations, which can then provide a map onto and merge into social behavior.
You can say something. Okay, well, I think we'll have to draw things to a close there. I think, well, I'm sure we've asked more questions than we've answered, but that's probably the nature of the thing.
But we will tell you the dress is black and blue.
Yes, sure, yeah. Thanks very much, everyone, for coming. And yeah, please enjoy the work. And you can also purchase Chatelet's book at the back of the gallery there if you want to find out more. Thanks very much.